The graceful ballerina, Ashley Benefield, once a symbol of beauty and poise, was about to become a murderer. In the blink of an eye, a shot rang out. Welcome to Crime of Passion. Tonight, we step into the world of secrets, betrayal, and a deadly twist you won't see coming. Settle in, find a quiet space, and let the tension build with every word. This story may seem like one of self-defense, but as we peel back the layers, you'll soon realize that nothing is as it seems. Dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let the chilling truth of the Black Swan manslaughter case unfold. By the end, you won't just be questioning the crime, you'll be questioning everything you thought you knew about justice. Ashley Benefield was once the picture of elegance, grace, and poise. As a ballerina, her world was built on discipline and perfection. Every movement was calculated, every leap a symbol of strength and beauty. Her life, it seemed, was destined for the spotlight. Born in Florida, Ashley's early life was marked by a passion for dance. She was one of those rare individuals who could effortlessly turn the mundane into something beautiful. From a young age, it was clear that ballet was more than a hobby, it was her calling. But behind the poised ballerina was a woman with dreams beyond the stage. As she grew older, Ashley sought more than the world of dance could offer. The fame, the applause, the admiration, it wasn't enough. She wanted something real, something she could claim as her own outside the world of pirouettes and tutus. That's when she met Doug Benefield. Doug seemed like everything Ashley had ever wanted in a partner. A man who supported her ambitions, who was there for every show, every performance. In the beginning, he seemed like the perfect match. Tall, handsome, and charming, Doug was a man of confidence, someone who seemed to understand the demands of Ashley's career. They got married in their early 20s, and for a while, everything felt like a fairy tale. But soon, the cracks began to show. As Ashley's career flourished, Doug became more possessive. He would show up unannounced at rehearsals, questioning her late nights, even accusing her of having affairs with other dancers. The paranoia began to seep into their relationship. What had started as a supportive marriage slowly turned into something darker, something suffocating. By the time July 2024 came around, their marriage was nothing like it had been in the beginning. The love that had once connected them was now buried under layers of suspicion, resentment, and verbal attacks. But even Ashley couldn't have predicted how it would all end. It was supposed to be just another evening, another argument between a married couple with too many issues to resolve. But it was that night, the night of the shooting, that would change their lives forever. The arguments between Ashley and Doug had become more frequent, more intense. From the outside, they appeared to be a happy couple. Attending events, posting pictures on social media, trying to maintain the facade of a picture-perfect marriage. But behind the doors of their Florida home, things were falling apart. Doug's jealousy had turned into something much darker. He was no longer just a man upset by Ashley's late hours. He became verbally abusive. There were accusations of infidelity, constant questioning of her loyalty, and even threats that left Ashley terrified. One of their close friends recalls a dinner party where Doug had made an out-of-place comment. He had casually suggested that Ashley was just like all the other women who were going to cheat on him. The room fell silent. Ashley had laughed it off, but deep inside, she knew this wasn't just a passing comment, it was a sign of things to come. As the pressure mounted, Ashley found herself trapped in a marriage that had turned toxic. But she felt she had no way out. Leaving Doug would mean abandoning her dreams, her career. Everything she had worked so hard for. At times, it felt as though every move she made was under the watchful eye of a man who had lost trust in her. And yet, despite everything, Ashley still tried to keep the peace. But Doug wasn't interested in peace. One day, after another heated argument, Ashley made the decision to call it quits. She wanted a divorce. Doug, however, would not go quietly. The arguments escalated to violent outbursts, and it seemed that no matter how hard she tried, Ashley couldn't escape the storm that was brewing in their marriage. It was only a matter of time before things would explode. On the night of July 2024, Ashley and Doug found themselves once again locked in a heated argument. This time, however, something was different. Doug was angrier than he had ever been. He had already been drinking heavily, and his words were slurred but sharp. The accusations were flying faster than Ashley could defend herself. She had had enough. She didn't want to fight anymore. She just wanted to be free of the man who had controlled her life for so long. But Doug wasn't going to let go that easily. "You think you can just walk away from me? You think you can leave without any consequences?" Doug shouted, stepping toward her with a menacing look in his eyes. Ashley could feel the heat of his anger, and she knew it wasn't going to end well. He had crossed a line, again. He was getting too close, his hands reaching for her in a way that sent chills down her spine. She instinctively backed up, trying to keep distance between them. "I'm done, Doug," she said, her voice shaking. "Please, just let me go." But Doug wasn't listening. In his drunken fury, he lunged at her, knocking over a vase on the coffee table. The glass shattered. For the first time, Ashley felt truly afraid. She had been in this situation before, but tonight felt different. There was something in Doug's eyes. Something that told her he might actually hurt her this time. She rushed toward the hallway, her heart racing. Her hand brushed against the cold metal of the gun Doug kept in a drawer for protection. Without thinking, she grabbed it. She knew she had no choice. He was going to hurt her. This was her only option. The gun felt heavy in her hands, and her breath caught in her throat as Doug advanced on her. She shouted for him to stop. But Doug just laughed, his twisted grin revealing how far gone he was. He lunged. The shot rang out, loud and sharp, breaking the silence of the night. Doug staggered, his hands clutching his chest. He fell to the floor in an instant, his life ending before his body hit the ground. Ashley stood frozen, the gun still gripped tightly in her hand. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at what she had done. The man she once loved, the man who had been her tormentor, now lay dead before her. What had just happened? Had she acted in self-defense, or was this something more? As the seconds stretched on, Ashley's mind raced. She couldn't comprehend what had just occurred. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but her thoughts were jumbled. Was Doug really going to kill her? Had she done the right thing? She stumbled back, dropping the gun as her body seemed to give way under the weight of the moment. It felt as if the world had stopped. The minutes ticked by before she picked up the phone. Her hands were trembling as she dialed 911. "Please. I need help," she whispered into the phone. I shot him. I shot my husband." The operator's calm voice cut through her panic. "Stay calm, ma'am. We're sending help immediately." When the police arrived, they found Doug dead in the living room. His body was still warm, and his face held a mixture of confusion and rage that would forever remain frozen in time. Ashley was arrested on the spot and taken in for questioning. The story she told was one of self-defense. She described the violence, the threats, and the fear she had felt when Doug came at her. She said she acted out of desperation. But the truth was far more complicated than that. The trial that followed would be one of the most highly publicized events of 2024. The media quickly seized on the case, dubbing it the Black Swan murder, a nod to Ashley's ballet career. It was impossible for people to ignore the contrast between the delicate ballerina and the woman now accused of taking another life. The courtroom was filled with tension. On one side, Ashley's defense team argued that she had been a victim of years of abuse. They claimed that the years of emotional manipulation, verbal abuse, and constant threats had pushed Ashley to the brink. They argued that her actions were not premeditated, but a natural response to a life-threatening situation. They used battered woman syndrome as their main defense, attempting to show that Ashley was acting out of pure survival. On the other side, the prosecution painted a different picture. They claimed that Ashley had fired the gun out of anger, not fear. The prosecution argued that Ashley had planned the shooting in advance, showing a cold, calculated side that belied her claims of self-defense. They pointed to the gun being within easy reach and Ashley's calm demeanor when she called 911 as evidence of her premeditated intent. The jury listened intently, but the evidence presented by both sides only seemed to confuse the issue more. Was Ashley truly a victim of abuse, or had she snapped in a moment of rage? For weeks, the trial proceeded, with Ashley taking the stand and describing her life with Doug. The tension in the room was palpable, and the media coverage only added to the public's growing fascination with the case. Finally, after weeks of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Ashley Benefield was convicted of manslaughter. The world was left to grapple with the question, was Ashley a victim, or was she a woman who took the law into her own hands? The Black Swan manslaughter case became a symbol of domestic abuse, of the fine line between self-defense and murder, and of how quickly a life can change in the blink of an eye. It's a case that raises uncomfortable questions about justice, about the lengths people will go to in order to escape abuse, and about the emotional scars that can linger long after the physical ones have healed. As for Ashley, her life as she once knew it was over. The ballerina who had once captivated audiences was now a convicted killer, a woman who had lived her entire life under the spotlight, only to have it consume her in the end. Story 2. He promised it was over, but for Louise Hunt and her family, the nightmare was just beginning. In a brutal act of revenge, Kyle Clifford shattered their lives. This is the shocking truth behind the Hunt family murders. In broad daylight, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in Hertfordshire, a BBC commentator's world collapsed in just 20 minutes. While John Hunt called horse races for millions of listeners, his ex-daughter's boyfriend was methodically executing his wife and both daughters with medieval precision, using weapons that belonged in a museum, not a modern murder scene. By the time the police arrived at their £800,000 family home, 3 generations of Hunt women were dead, and the killer had vanished into the London sprawl, leaving behind a crime so calculated it would rewrite the book on domestic terrorism. The sun was high on that Tuesday afternoon in Bushey, Hertfordshire. The sleepy town, known for its peaceful streets and friendly faces, was about to become the scene of an unimaginable horror. John Hunt, a respected BBC commentator, was doing what he did best, calling horse races for millions of listeners. His voice, calm and composed, echoed through radio waves, delivering commentary that had become synonymous with British racing. He was one of the most trusted voices in the sport, and at that very moment, his world seemed safe, anchored in the familiarity of his daily work. But as John was wrapped up in the races, something far more sinister was unfolding within the walls of his family's £800,000 home just a few miles away. The peaceful tranquility of their suburban lifestyle was about to be shattered in a way they could never have prepared for. Kyle Clifford, a man who had once been welcomed into their home, was lurking in the shadows, preparing for a brutal act of vengeance that would tear the Hunt family apart. Kyle wasn't just angry, he was consumed by rage and jealousy, fueled by a bitter breakup with Louise Hunt, John's daughter. He had been part of their lives for a time, but after the relationship soured, things quickly took a dark turn. Despite their breakup, Louise's family was unaware of the depth of Kyle's obsession and the violence that was festering inside him. What began as a toxic relationship had devolved into a bitter revenge plot. Kyle didn't just want to end the relationship, he wanted to destroy everything that Louise had left. Kyle had been planning this for weeks. There had been no outward signs of his violent intentions, no warnings for the Hunt family to brace themselves. To them, everything was normal, but to Kyle, the world had wronged him, and he was ready to make them pay. As the afternoon dragged on, Kyle readied himself. It was a meticulously planned execution, a crime so calculated, it would haunt the lives of the victims forever. He had his weapons of choice, an ancient crossbow and a butcher's knife, tools that belonged in a different time. They weren't weapons of convenience. No, this was methodical. Kyle had spent days preparing for this. His first victim would be Carol Hunt, Louise's mother. She was in the kitchen, the scent of a home-cooked meal filling the air. Her world would end with a single, swift strike. Hannah, Louise's younger sister, was upstairs, unaware of the terror that awaited her. She was listening to music, lost in her own world, when Kyle moved into position. He had planned this meticulously. He knew the layout of the house, he knew the routines, he knew exactly where each person would be. And then there was Louise. The one person Kyle believed had betrayed him. She was coming home from work, just like any other day. She would never have suspected that her past, the man she had once loved, was waiting to take everything from her. Kyle knew they would never see him coming. His anger had festered in silence, and now, in this cold, calculated moment, he would execute his plan with precision. He moved quickly, silently, through the back door. The house was large, and every room was filled with memories, laughter, and the warmth of family life. But to Kyle, it was just a house full of people who had wronged him, and it was time to make them pay. At 3:10 p.m., the first shot was fired. It came so suddenly, so quietly, that it would have been impossible to know what had happened until it was too late. Carol Hunt, standing in the kitchen preparing dinner, felt a sharp pain in her back before she even had the chance to react. Kyle had used the crossbow, silent, deadly. The bolt buried itself deep into Carol's spine. She crumpled to the floor with a soft gasp, her body falling limp. The woman who had raised Louise and Hannah was gone in an instant. The sound of the crossbow firing was drowned out by the everyday hum of the world outside. No one would hear it. No one would know that the Hunt family's world had just been irreversibly shattered. As Carol collapsed, Kyle stood over her, his eyes empty. There was no joy in his actions, just the cold satisfaction of seeing his revenge unfold as he'd planned. Hannah, still upstairs, heard a noise, a thud, followed by silence. She rushed out of her room, heart racing. But as she descended the staircase, she caught sight of Kyle standing in the hallway, his face expressionless, his eyes focused. The moment their eyes locked, she knew something was terribly wrong. Before she could scream, before she could even react, Kyle lunged forward with the butcher's knife. It was swift, clinical, and unyielding. The blade drove deep into her chest, silencing her in an instant. Kyle didn't waste a second. He moved to the next room, where Louise would soon arrive. It was as if time had stopped for Louise. She stepped through the front door, her keys jangling in her hand. The house was unusually quiet, and a sense of unease washed over her as she glanced around, wondering why no one was there to greet her. Her mind was still focused on the mundane details of her day. She didn't expect to find her family lying dead. She didn't know that Kyle was already there, waiting. She walked toward the living room, and that's when she saw him. Standing in the shadows, his figure looming large in the dimly lit hallway. For a split second, their eyes met, and in that brief moment, Louise realized the nightmare had come to life. The man who had once claimed to love her was now the one who would end her life. Before she could call out or flee, Kyle was on her. He grabbed her, forcing her into the living room. She struggled, but his grip was too strong. Her cries for help were muffled by the silence of the house. Kyle didn't waste time with words. He didn't need to explain why. His motive was clear. In his mind, Louise had betrayed him, and this was the price she would pay. With cold efficiency, he raised the butcher's knife, the weapon that had already claimed 2 lives in this house, and brought it down on Louise. Her body crumpled to the ground, her last breath escaping her lips in a quiet gasp. By the time the police arrived, it was too late. The Hunt family's house, once filled with love and laughter, was now a crime scene, a chilling reminder of how quickly a life can unravel. 3 generations of Hunt women were dead, and the killer was nowhere to be found. When the first responders arrived on the scene, they were confronted with an image of brutality that they would never forget. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious motive, just the bodies of 3 women lying lifeless on the floor. It was as if the killer had planned each move with cold precision, never giving them a chance to fight back. The community was in shock. No one could believe that something so horrific had happened in their own neighborhood. Friends and family of the victims were left with more questions than answers. Where was Kyle Clifford? How had he managed to carry out such a meticulous plan and then disappear without a trace? The police immediately launched a massive manhunt. Kyle was no stranger to the streets of London, and they feared he could be anywhere. They knew they were dealing with a killer who had carefully planned every aspect of his escape. Weeks passed, and the hunt for Kyle continued, but it seemed like he had vanished into thin air. Weeks passed, and Kyle Clifford was still a ghost, vanishing into the vastness of London's sprawling streets. The manhunt was relentless. Police combed through every lead, every potential sighting. Every tip was investigated, but Kyle remained elusive. He had planned his escape meticulously, disappearing into the shadows with a chilling calm that suggested he had done this before. But with each passing day, the authorities grew more desperate. As much as they wanted to find him, they also feared that Kyle would slip through their fingers forever. The Hunt family's loved ones were left to cope with their grief, while their anguish grew with each hour that passed without a breakthrough. The pain of losing 3 family members to such a heinous crime weighed heavily on them, but there was also a gnawing question: where was Kyle Clifford? Then, one day, a break came. It was an ordinary Tuesday when the call came in. A local shopkeeper, who had seen the news coverage of the murders, recognized Kyle from a CCTV image. The shopkeeper didn't know his name, but the features, those cold eyes, were unmistakable. He had been in the area a few days prior, buying supplies. And that single observation would set the wheels in motion. The police immediately sprung into action. Officers descended on the location, a rundown flat in East London, and began to canvass the area. They couldn't let him slip away. There was no time to waste. With the image of his face still fresh in the minds of the public, the authorities were confident that Kyle couldn't stay hidden for much longer. Hours later, after an intense and fast-paced search, the police found themselves at the doorstep of an abandoned building. It was a quiet part of the city, far removed from the horrific events of the murders. But as officers entered the flat, the atmosphere inside was suffocating. There, lying in a corner, was Kyle Clifford, exactly where they thought he would be. No escape route, no final fight. Kyle Clifford was finally in custody. The arrest was eerily calm. There was no standoff. Kyle didn't resist. He didn't try to run. In fact, some officers would later describe him as almost resigned. It was as if he knew his time had run out. The look on his face, cold and emotionless, sent shivers down the spines of those who encountered him. He didn't express regret. There were no tears, no pleas for mercy. The man who had executed such brutal murders with chilling precision was now under arrest, but the damage had already been done. 3 innocent women were dead, their lives erased in an act of revenge so dark, so calculated, it would haunt their families forever. As the trial date neared, the details of the investigation came to light. Kyle had planned every step of his brutal attack with unnerving precision. Detectives worked tirelessly to piece together the timeline of events, but what they uncovered was terrifying. From the moment Kyle entered the Hunt family's home, he had been in complete control. He knew exactly where each victim would be. He had calculated the most efficient route, the best time to strike. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about making the victims suffer, making them realize their helplessness in the face of his rage. The police discovered that, in the days leading up to the murders, Kyle had done everything to avoid suspicion. He had used burner phones to communicate with the Hunt family members, pretending to make amends while secretly plotting their deaths. He didn't want anyone to know what was coming. He didn't want anyone to be able to stop him. Kyle's history of manipulation and emotional abuse came to the forefront during the investigation. He had controlled Louise for so long, breaking her down bit by bit, until she finally found the strength to leave him. But for Kyle, that wasn't enough. His need for control didn't end with the breakup. In his mind, he had to punish them, punish Louise for walking away from him. Punish her family for letting her go. The authorities quickly learned that Kyle had a history of violent outbursts and had been involved in several altercations before. But nothing had prepared them for the violence he would unleash on the Hunt family. His anger was a ticking time bomb, and when it finally exploded, it destroyed everything in its path. The details of the killings were horrifying. Carol Hunt was killed first, struck with the crossbow while she was preparing dinner. The shot was clean, quick. Kyle wanted her out of the way before she could warn anyone. Hannah was next. She came downstairs, unaware of what had just happened, and was immediately stabbed in the chest. Her screams were silenced in an instant. Finally, Louise. The last one to arrive home, the last to see the carnage. But she, too, was overpowered and killed without mercy. The police were horrified at the brutality of the murders. Kyle had executed his plan so well that there was no chance for the family to defend themselves. No chance for them to escape. The brutality of it all left detectives in shock, and the community could hardly comprehend what had transpired in their quiet neighborhood. In the months following Kyle's capture, the media frenzy surrounding the case reached a fever pitch. The details of the murders were too horrifying for the public to ignore. The question on everyone's mind was simple: what could drive a person to commit such a gruesome act? The trial began in early 2025, and the courtroom was packed with reporters, families, and onlookers. The atmosphere was tense, charged with emotion. For the Hunt family's surviving relatives, the trial was their chance to find some measure of justice. But no amount of justice could ever bring back what they had lost. The prosecution wasted no time in painting Kyle as a man driven by revenge. His actions weren't those of someone who had acted impulsively, they were deliberate, planned, and executed with terrifying precision. Kyle had hunted his victims, and in the end, he had taken their lives with an unnerving coldness. There was no doubt that this was not an act of passion, but an act of calculated violence born out of bitterness and jealousy. Kyle's defense team tried to argue that his mental state was unstable, that his obsession with Louise had clouded his judgment. They attempted to paint him as a man who had snapped, who had been driven over the edge by an overwhelming sense of betrayal. But the evidence was clear. Kyle had planned every step of the murders. He had researched his weapons, practiced his aim, and studied the Hunt family's routines. There was no question about his intent, this was a cold-blooded act of revenge. As the trial continued, the jury was presented with more and more evidence that painted Kyle as a man who had been planning this for months. His obsession with Louise had turned into something far more dangerous, something that could only end in violence. The defense's attempts to paint him as mentally unstable were dismissed. The facts were clear. Kyle Clifford had executed a brutal act of revenge, and now, he would have to pay the price. In March 2025, after days of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict: Kyle Clifford was guilty of the murders of Louise, Carol, and Hannah Hunt. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and sorrow. The Hunt family's surviving relatives could finally breathe a sigh of relief, knowing that the man responsible for their loss would never walk free again. Kyle was sentenced to life in prison, his fate sealed. But the damage he had caused was irreversible. 3 generations of women were gone, and a family had been torn apart by the man they had once trusted. The legacy of the Hunt family would never be the same. For the Hunt family, the trial was bittersweet. No sentence, no verdict, could bring back their loved ones. But it was a small step toward closure, a small piece of justice for the lives lost. As for Kyle, his life had been defined by darkness and rage. Once, he had been a part of a family that trusted him, loved him. Now, he was nothing more than a cold-blooded murderer, his legacy forever stained by his violent acts. The story of the Hunt family murders is a stark reminder that the darkest moments often come from those closest to us. When revenge, jealousy, and bitterness consume a person, the results can be catastrophic. Kyle Clifford's violent acts forever altered the lives of the Hunt family, leaving them with a grief that will never truly fade. And for Kyle, the life he once had, one filled with promise and potential, has been replaced with the cold confines of a prison cell. Story 3. Her honeymoon should have been the start of a beautiful life, until the man who promised to love her forever turned into her killer. In a remote hotel room in Meghalaya, a young bride's life was cut short. But this wasn't just a crime of passion, it was the deadly consequence of a toxic affair, betrayal, and lies. This is the shocking truth behind the Meghalaya honeymoon murder. Her honeymoon should have been the happiest time of her life. A time to celebrate love, a new chapter, and the promise of forever. But for Priya Das, a young woman from Kolkata, her honeymoon would become the beginning of a tragic and senseless end. It was June 2025, a month known for the warmth of summer in the northeastern hills of India. But in the picturesque state of Meghalaya, a chilling murder would unfold, one that would rock the country and expose a dark secret about the man she had married. Priya had always dreamed of a fairy tale romance. When she met Rahul, a charming businessman, everything seemed to fall into place. He was attentive, kind, and spoke of a future together, everything Priya had ever wanted. Their whirlwind romance led to a beautiful wedding in Kolkata, and soon after, they traveled to the scenic hill station of Shillong for their honeymoon. It was supposed to be a dream come true, a journey to celebrate their love. But what should have been a celebration of love turned into a nightmare that would haunt everyone involved. For just days after they checked into their hotel, Priya's lifeless body was found in their honeymoon suite, her dreams shattered in an instant. The authorities were called immediately, and as they arrived at the upscale hotel in Meghalaya, it was clear that this was no ordinary crime. Priya's body was discovered in the room with signs of violence, and the room itself had been strangely untouched, as if the killer had not planned to leave any trace. But the most horrifying discovery was yet to come. Her husband, Rahul, was nowhere to be found. In the hours that followed, the investigation unfolded with shocking details. The couple had checked into the hotel just 2 days before Priya's death, but friends and family would soon reveal that there was more to this marriage than anyone had known. Rahul had been having an affair for months before their wedding, a secret that Priya had no idea about. A secret that would ultimately lead to betrayal, jealousy, and a brutal act of violence. As the investigation gained momentum, the pieces started falling into place. Priya's dreams of a happy marriage were shattered not by the man who had promised to love her forever, but by the very same man. And Rahul's carefully hidden secrets were about to be exposed to the world. Rahul's affair with a woman from his office had been going on for nearly a year. While Priya believed she had found the perfect man, Rahul was living a double life. His affair had been passionate, and Priya's ignorance of it had left her vulnerable. Rahul never intended for Priya to find out, and yet, when he realized the end of his affair was drawing near, when Priya would inevitably begin asking questions, he made a choice that would alter his life forever. He chose to kill her. Meghalaya, a state known for its fog-covered hills, serene lakes, and tranquil surroundings, seemed the perfect place for a honeymoon. Priya and Rahul arrived at the luxury hotel nestled in the mountains, far from the bustling streets of Kolkata. The cool air, the breathtaking views, and the peaceful atmosphere should have provided the perfect escape for the newlyweds. It was everything they had imagined. On the outside, their relationship seemed perfect. Rahul was charming, attentive, and loving. Priya admired his ambition and looked up to him as a successful man who had his life together. They were married in an extravagant ceremony, and Priya's friends and family were thrilled for her. This marriage was the start of a new chapter, and Priya couldn't have been happier. She was in love, and she trusted Rahul with all her heart. But as the days passed, the honeymoon turned into something far more sinister. Priya began to notice small things that made her feel uneasy. Rahul's phone was always on silent, and he seemed distracted, lost in thought, more often than not. There was a tension in the air that Priya couldn't place, but she dismissed it, attributing it to the stress of wedding planning and the excitement of the trip. One evening, during a candlelit dinner overlooking the mountains, Rahul seemed colder than usual. Priya attributed it to the natural nerves that come with starting a new life with someone. But what she didn't know was that Rahul's mind wasn't on their new life together. His thoughts were occupied with the affair he was trying so desperately to keep hidden. For Rahul, the honeymoon was nothing more than a final performance, a facade to make Priya believe that everything was perfect. But behind his smiles and sweet words, he was plotting. His secret lover, someone who had been a constant presence in his life for months, was on his mind every moment. Rahul had promised his lover that their relationship would continue after the honeymoon, that their affair would return to its regular course. But the closer Priya got to discovering the truth, the more desperate Rahul became. The night Priya's life ended began like any other. Rahul and Priya had spent the day sightseeing, enjoying the natural beauty of the area. But in the evening, Rahul's plans took a darker turn. It was late when Rahul suggested they have a drink in their room. He was trying to be charming again, a gesture to make Priya feel safe, to ease the tension that had been building between them. But that night, something snapped inside him. Priya had asked him about the late-night phone calls, about the strange behavior she had been noticing. Rahul knew she was getting too close to the truth. In the quiet of their honeymoon suite, Rahul gave in to his jealousy, his anger, and his fear. With a violent push, he silenced the woman he had once promised to cherish. He grabbed the nearby lamp cord and strangled her. The violence was quick, he knew that this was his only way out. Priya struggled for only a few seconds, her eyes wide with disbelief and fear. The man she had loved, the man she trusted, had just taken everything from her. Her body lay lifeless on the bed as Rahul stared at the scene in front of him. For a moment, there was silence. The reality of what he had done began to settle in, but he didn't regret it. In his mind, it was the only way to keep his secret safe. He had to eliminate her, the one person who could ruin everything. But the murder wasn't the end of Rahul's deception. He still had to make it look like something else, something less suspicious. When hotel staff entered the room the next morning, they were met with the grim sight of Priya's lifeless body. The room, which had once been filled with excitement and romance, was now the scene of a brutal murder. The hotel staff immediately called the police, and soon, detectives were swarming the area, trying to piece together what had happened. The investigation began, but there was one problem: Rahul was missing. He had vanished, leaving no trace behind. His phone was switched off, and he had checked out of the hotel early, leaving behind his wife's lifeless body. The police immediately suspected foul play, and as they dug deeper, a disturbing truth began to emerge. Rahul had been having an affair, one that he had been hiding from Priya throughout their relationship. The affair was the key to understanding the motive behind the murder. Detectives soon learned about Rahul's secret lover, a woman with whom he had been involved for nearly a year. The affair had been intense, but Rahul's commitment to his new wife had forced him to keep the relationship a secret. Priya had never known. But as the investigation continued, the details began to come together. Rahul's motive was clear: jealousy, betrayal, and the fear that Priya would discover his secret. He had killed the woman he had once loved to protect the life he wanted to keep hidden. The search for Rahul was frantic. The police issued a nationwide alert, hoping to catch the man who had just committed an unspeakable crime. They scoured every corner of the city, hoping to find a lead. But Rahul had planned his escape carefully. He had spent days preparing, leaving no trace of his whereabouts. He had known the police would be on his trail, but he was confident that his plan would work. Days turned into weeks, and as the manhunt continued, the people of Meghalaya were left in shock. How could something like this happen? How could a honeymoon, a supposed symbol of love and new beginnings, turn into such a horrific tragedy? Finally, a tip led authorities to a small town in the outskirts of Kolkata. Rahul had been hiding in plain sight, trying to blend in while moving between friends and relatives. But the police were closing in, and soon, they found him in a small, run-down apartment. He was arrested without resistance. The trial of Rahul Kumar was one of the most talked-about cases in India. The details of the murder were shocking, and the prosecution quickly presented evidence that painted Rahul as a man driven by selfishness, jealousy, and rage. He had killed his wife in cold blood to protect his affair, a fact that left the courtroom in stunned silence. Rahul's defense team attempted to argue that his actions were a result of emotional distress, but the evidence was overwhelming. Rahul had planned the murder, and his affair was the clear motive behind the killing. In the end, the jury found him guilty of murder, and Rahul was sentenced to life in prison. As Priya's family and friends mourned the loss of a young woman with so much promise, they were left to grapple with the devastating reality of her death. Priya's dreams of a happy life with her husband had been ripped away by the very person who had vowed to cherish and protect her. The Meghalaya honeymoon murder serves as a chilling reminder that behind closed doors, secrets can be deadly. What should have been a time of love and happiness for Priya turned into a tragic story of betrayal and violence. Rahul's actions will haunt those who loved Priya for the rest of their lives. Story 4. One man's life was ended in an instant, but what led to the deadly shot that rang out in Birmingham? A jealous boyfriend, a high school football coach, and a love triangle that exploded in a violent moment of rage. This is the shocking story of the Demetrius Beverly shooting, where passion turned deadly, and a life was claimed in the blink of an eye. The summer heat of Birmingham, Alabama, hung heavy in the air as the clock struck midnight on a warm August evening in 2025. For most people in the city, the night passed by unnoticed, just another summer night under the stars. But for those involved in the tragic events that were about to unfold, this was a night that would change everything. Demetrius Beverly, a well-known high school football coach, was a beloved figure in his community. At 32 years old, he had dedicated his life to coaching, mentoring, and shaping the lives of young athletes. He was more than just a coach. He was a father figure, a friend, and a leader to the many players who had passed through his program. That night, Demetrius wasn't on the football field or at a game. Instead, he was in the apartment of a woman he had known for some time, a woman whose name would become tied to the events of that fateful night. But what was supposed to be a quiet visit, a simple moment between two people, quickly turned into something far darker, something that would end in violence and death. It all began when Decorlian Keyshawn Robinson, the boyfriend of the woman Demetrius was visiting, walked into the apartment. Decorlian was just 25 years old. Like Demetrius, he had a presence about him, one that commanded attention when he walked into a room. But unlike Demetrius, who was admired and respected, Decorlian's reputation was marked by a history of temper, violence, and jealousy. He wasn't a man known for his ability to control his emotions. And that night, his inability to do so would have devastating consequences. What followed was a series of events that would make headlines across the country and shake the community to its core. But to understand what happened, we have to first understand the tension that had been building in the relationship between Decorlian and his girlfriend, and the part Demetrius played in it. It was no secret that Decorlian and his girlfriend's relationship had been on shaky ground. Their tumultuous relationship was filled with ups and downs, filled with passion, but also filled with the kind of jealousy and distrust that can tear a couple apart. Decorlian, with his possessiveness and insecurity, had grown increasingly suspicious of the time his girlfriend spent with Demetrius. Though Demetrius and the woman had a purely platonic relationship, Decorlian couldn't see it that way. He viewed Demetrius as a threat, someone who posed a risk to his hold on the woman he claimed as his own. What had been brewing for months, unspoken tension, seething jealousy, and unresolved resentment, would come to a head that night. The moment Decorlian entered the apartment, the air was thick with animosity. The three of them were in the living room, Demetrius sitting on the couch, the woman standing nearby, when Decorlian walked in. The atmosphere changed instantly. Demetrius, who had no idea of the storm that was brewing, looked up and offered a friendly smile. He had no reason to expect anything other than a normal evening. But Decorlian, his eyes dark with anger, took one look at Demetrius and immediately sensed a threat. The conversation, at first, seemed harmless. But as Decorlian grew more agitated, his words became more hostile. He began accusing Demetrius of overstepping boundaries, of being too close to his girlfriend. He ranted about trust, about respect, and how he couldn't understand why Demetrius kept coming around. Demetrius, ever the calm one, tried to defuse the situation, trying to reassure de Courleon that there was nothing more to their relationship than friendship. But de Courleon was not hearing it. His jealousy, his rage, was too much for him to contain. As the argument escalated, the situation became more volatile. De Courleon's anger was no longer just about his suspicions, it had become a full-blown emotional storm. Every word he spoke seemed to drive him deeper into his fury. His emotions, so long suppressed, had exploded into a dangerous force of jealousy and possessiveness. Demetrius tried his best to remain calm, to talk sense into de Courleon, but he was being drawn into a whirlwind of violence and passion that was beyond his control. At this point, Demetrius could sense that the situation had shifted. He knew de Courleon was getting more and more agitated, and he tried to de-escalate the situation. He stood up, attempting to put some physical distance between himself and the increasingly violent boyfriend. But that movement, that moment of separation, seemed to be the trigger that sent de Courleon over the edge. Before Demetrius could react, de Courleon pulled out a handgun that had been concealed in his waistband. The room went still for a moment of disbelief. Demetrius didn't even have time to process what was happening. The weapon, now in de Courleon's trembling hands, was a symbol of his control, his rage. De Courleon's face contorted with fury as he pointed the gun at Demetrius. The words that came from his mouth were filled with venom, accusations, threats, all born from the jealousy and distrust that had been festering in him for so long. The woman, paralyzed with fear, tried to intervene, to calm de Courleon down, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. In an instant, de Courleon pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the room, a deafening sound that shattered the night and left everything in its wake. Demetrius collapsed to the ground, the life draining from him as he fell to the floor. The woman, in a state of shock, screamed, but it was too late. Demetrius's body lay still in the middle of the room, a victim of a crime of passion that had been building for months. De Courleon stood over him, the gun still in his hand, his chest heaving with emotion. He had done what he believed was necessary, what his jealousy had convinced him was the only solution. The woman, frozen in horror, realized that the man she had loved, the man she had trusted, had just taken the life of someone who had been nothing but kind to her. In the chaos that followed, de Courleon made a quick decision. He ran, disappearing into the night, leaving behind a room full of confusion and tragedy. The woman was left with only the echo of the gunshot in her mind and the horrifying realization of what had just occurred. The shooting of Demetrius Beverly sent shockwaves through the community. People who had known him, his players, his colleagues, his family, were left stunned and devastated by the loss of a man who had been an inspiration to so many. It was hard to believe that someone like Demetrius, a man known for his dedication and positivity, could be taken down by a jealous lover's rage. But the search for de Courleon Keyshawn Robinson was just beginning. The authorities were immediately alerted to the shooting, and the investigation quickly gained momentum. Witnesses reported hearing the gunshot, but de Courleon was long gone by the time the police arrived at the apartment. The woman, still in shock, tried to explain what had happened, but she struggled to comprehend the gravity of the situation herself. In the days that followed, the police launched a manhunt for de Courleon. They used every resource available to track him down, but he had gone into hiding. His history of violent behavior, his unstable emotions, and his jealousy had culminated in a crime that he would soon have to answer for. As the investigation progressed, the story of the shooting began to take shape. Police uncovered the details of de Courleon's affair with the woman Demetrius had been visiting. The affair, which had begun as a secret relationship, had been a driving force behind the tragic incident. De Courleon had believed, in his delusion, that killing Demetrius would resolve his issues, would allow him to keep his relationship intact. The legal battle that followed would be long and complicated. De Courleon's defense attorney attempted to argue that the shooting was not murder, but manslaughter. They suggested that de Courleon had acted in the heat of passion, overwhelmed by jealousy in the moment. It was an argument that sought to reduce the severity of the crime, but it did little to calm the anger of the community. For those who knew Demetrius, this was not a crime of passion, it was a deliberate act of violence born from selfishness and rage. In the months following the murder, the trial of DeCorleone Keyshawn Robinson became a focal point of national attention. The defense argued that the murder was a result of uncontrollable emotion, but the prosecution painted a different picture, one of a man who had premeditated the act of violence and allowed his jealousy to guide him to murder. The jury listened intently as the details of the case were presented. They were forced to consider the nuances of the crime, the emotional motivations, and the devastating consequences of a jealous outburst. In the end, the question of whether DeCorleone had acted in the heat of passion or with calculated malice became the key issue. When the jury returned their verdict, the room was filled with tension. It wasn't just the question of guilt or innocence, it was the question of justice. Would DeCorleone face the full consequences of his actions, or would his emotional state reduce the severity of the crime? In the end, DeCorleone was convicted of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, a verdict that many felt was too lenient for the loss of a beloved coach and mentor. Demetrius Beverley's life was tragically cut short by an act of jealousy and rage. The community mourned the loss of a man who had given everything to his players, his students, and his family. DeCorleone Robinson, driven by an obsessive need for control, had taken everything from Demetrius in a single moment of violence. As we reflect on the events of that night, we are reminded of the devastating consequences of jealousy and uncontrolled emotion. What could have been a story of love and growth ended in tragedy? A reminder that sometimes the darkest emotions can drive a person to do the unthinkable. Thank you for joining us for this haunting tale. Until next time, remember, sometimes the most tragic stories come from the people we least expect. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. And be sure to subscribe for more calming true crime stories to accompany your peaceful nights. We've got many more stories waiting for you.